Everybody, I'm Matt Bennett with ThirdWay. That's Bennett with 2 T's, notwithstanding what the guy coming after us will tell you about how this name is spelled. And I'm delighted to be joined by my old friend Jamal Simmons. We have known each other since we were future former young people.
I had hair and his was dark.
Yes. We worked together most recently, I suppose, on the Gore and Clark campaign. So naturally, they've asked us to talk about how to win. I think we're the right guys for that. And obviously, one of the things that I think folks here are most keen to hear from you is about Vice President Harris. Jamal, of course, worked in the White House as communications director for the Vice President. He now is a commentator for CNN, among other things, and one of the most astute observers of American politics that we have. So I'm really delighted to get this chance to talk to you about it.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Lauren, everybody, Liam.
Yeah, Lauren, Liam, everybody for this. Look, we've heard all day from various members of this party where the real energy and where the vote-rich parts of the country really are. And I think, as you know, there's a huge debate inside campaigns, inside the party, about where to put the emphasis. And the big question now, because our party all of a sudden has a brand new leader, is what is her theory of the case on how she's going to win this election? Now, I know when you were there was no thought of this. That was not a thing. But you know her well enough to know how she's, maybe you're just thinking about it a little bit. How is she thinking about that?
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me just say I am here on my own. I am not a spokesperson for the Vice President. I do not work with the campaign or associated with the campaign in any way, so my thoughts are my own. But here's what I'll say. When you're Vice President, in the back of your mind, you're always thinking, or at least the staff, is always thinking a little bit about what it might be one day to run for president. Right? How can you not? Right? So many of the vice presidents have tried. And in fact, every Democratic vice president who's ever sought the nomination in modern times has won it. Right? From Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale and Al Gore and Joe Biden, obviously. So it's always something that's there. So there are things you do thinking, oh, well, we should go out and meet people. We're going to a town. Let's go and and invite somebody from a labor union to come to the event so we can make sure we say hello. Or this person is a great Democratic delegate. Let's invite them to the meet and greet. So you're always thinking a little bit about how do you build capacity. And one of the things that happened over the last few years is we began to realize that fewer and fewer people, and I bet you a lot of people in this room, don't watch networks like the one that I work at most often. You don't watch them every day. People get more and more information on their phones. I see people in the room right now who are like staring at their phones, right? So if so many people are getting that information that way, how is it that we communicate that way? And if you remember, back in a couple of years ago, Democrats weren't going on TikTok. Even though so many voters were getting their information from TikTok, Democrats weren't going on TikTok. So we had to find a way during the 2022 midterms to talk to people who were on TikTok. So we had people who were TikTok creators who would come. We invited them to do meet and greets, or not meet and greets, but to come and meet the Vice President if they were in Washington, or they would interview her when she was standing at the end of an event and they would say hello. So she had been building kind of relationships with people online for the last few years. And that exploded over the last year and a half. This woman named Stephanie Young, who replaced me when I came into the Vice President's office. And Stephanie was very intent also on very big cultural relevance. And so when you see the Vice President get chosen to be, or I shouldn't say chosen, but to be kind of anointed by Joe Biden and chosen as his candidate for president, and then you see this burst of excitement that comes from the social media community that didn't just pop out of nowhere. Those were relationships. You think about it like kindling that was laying around everywhere, and then Joe Biden threw the match, and then the flame was lit. And I think we now are seeing the benefits in terms of the Democratic Party, seeing how all those relationships are going to her benefit as she's running for president.
So that's interesting because one of the raps on Vice President Harris, early on at least, was well, there was a little bit of chaos among her staff, and there was some turnover. And,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
yeah, so, and a lot of that's inside baseball that no voters really give a crap about, but it is a question about how well her staff is going to perform when the spotlight turns on. And it turned on all of a sudden, and it seems to me at least, they performed brilliantly. I mean, I don't think that rollout could have gone any better. What do you think the current state of the OVP staff is, and how do you think that's integrating with the campaign? How do you think all that's going?
She's got a great group of people who work for her. Lorraine Bowles has been there, who we've known for a long time. She's the chief of staff. She's the one who hired me. She's been kind of a consistent presence for the last couple of years. And Lorraine has built a team of people around who are able to kind of do the job well with the vice president. I think for anybody, by the way, who's concerned about any of these stories about staff turnover or what happened in the past, you know what? Just hire the vice president and the human resources director, and let's move on. All right, this is not a big deal. So what you will see, though, is you will see more and more people, probably from the Vice President's Alumni Association, who are going into the campaign or some part of the campaign. 300 of us, 300 of the alumni wrote, and these are people from the DA's office, the AG's office, the Senate office, the Vice President's office, all signed a letter sort of endorsing her for president and talking about why we thought she'd be a good president. So people who worked for her, who know her well, who think that she'd be great at the job. So I think you will see some of those people come into the campaign because they know the vice president's work style. They know the way she likes to get, briefings done. She has confidence in them. And so I think that will help her focus on being a good candidate every day, while the staff is sort of doing the mechanics of just running an organization.
Yeah, that letter was a nice contrast, of course, to the former Trump employees, some of whom he tried to have murdered, and others just aren't endorsing him for other reasons. But I think
trying to have me murdered might be
that's
the one
big
thing that
one.
would break my
Seems
break
like
my
it's
support.
hard to endorse after that. Yeah. But well, let's talk about the electorate, because what we're talking about here today is, I think, a broad misapprehension about a bunch of areas of the electorate, most especially, as we heard in some presentations, where young people are, politically, ideologically. Vice President Harris has now served for 3.5 years in Joe Biden's administration. How fully do you think she has kind of adopted his theory of politics, his kind of ideological approach to getting to the same ends that all Democrats really share?
Well, really, you can trace this back to the beginning of her career. In many ways, obviously, she's been a prosecutor her entire life. And she started in 2020 in that debate with Mike Pence. I think you started to see her take on Joe Biden's positions, because that's the job of vice president. You're a pip, you're not Gladys Knight, right? So your job is to sing backup to the person who's out front. And I think you've seen her do that in the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And so she also was a real partner to the president. And I think people misunderestimate, to use a George Bush term, these people are too young to probably know. But I think people underestimate how much of a partner she was to the president, how often that she was in the Oval Office. If you're in the West Wing, the Oval Office is as far away from the vice president's office as that last pillar is from the stage. And so they would walk back and forth. We were, in the beginning when I first got there, it was during the pandemic. At the end of the pandemic, and the White House COVID protocols were still in place. So many of us couldn't sit in the same room when we had meetings. We had to do these meetings on Zoom. And so it was horrible. I mean, I would sit in an office and I could hear the person in the office next to me talking. We were on the same Zoom, but we couldn't be in the same room. So sometimes we'd be on these Zoom calls, and every once in a while, the president would just walk in the door in the middle of like a Zoom call. And, oh, I'm sorry, you're talking to your staff. And then, and she's like, oh, I'll get up. And then he'll be like, no, don't worry about it. And it became this like back and forth thing that happens often between people. And then all of a sudden the screen would go black because someone just turned it off so that we couldn't pay attention to whatever they had to talk about. So the two of them would go back and forth a lot. There were days also, national security, we don't talk about a lot. But she was really a partner to the president of national security. I think you saw, starting in 2022, her going to Munich, to that Munich conference, and the run up to the Russia invasion, to deliver some tough messages and to talk to partners and allies. And then, she kept doing that. She went back again a second time. She met with people abroad. I would sometimes get a phone call in the morning from the chief of staff that would say, hey, we've got something on the schedule for whatever time. Could you move that around? The vice president was in the Situation Room last night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, so we're going to give her a little extra time this morning. So that's the kind of thing that would happen a lot when you're in the building, and I think that showed the kind of partnership, I think, between them, and that partnership extends to issues and legislation, and her being a part of designing some of the bills that people think about as Biden bills, but they really were Biden-Harris bills. And when she wasn't there, her policy director was there, or her legal counsel was in the room, and were fully involved.
And I think that strikes me as one of the central answers to the obvious attacks that are already coming from the Trump right. They just went up with ads today, attacking her as a San Francisco liberal, blah, 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 and trotting out some statements that she made when she either first arrived in the Senate or when she ran for president in 2020, when the world was pre-pandemic. It was after the murder of George Floyd. It was a completely different world that we lived in, and she had not been vice president for 3.5 years. How do you see her kind of navigating that?
Well, as I think about it, it's almost silly for us to go back to things she said in 2018 and 2019 instead of looking at things that she helped do when she was vice president of the United States. So, take defund the police, for instance. While they were in office, the president, vice president had the Safe for America's plan that put $37 billion into policing in the country. So that's not a defund. It wasn't a defund bill. But we also were having the conversation in a soundbite, and the way she thinks about the world, from my experience, is much more holistically. The one word I would use for her, people have used it here for other reasons, is pragmatic. She's a lawyer, she looks at evidence. She was a prosecutor. She looks at evidence, and then she uses that evidence to help drive the ultimate outcome, the ultimate decision. She doesn't arrive at a conclusion and then go try to find the evidence to prove it. And so very often in the process of even writing speeches or writing press releases for her to look at, she would circle a word and say, what does that word mean? And then we sort of tell her, and she'd say, well, you should say what that means, not just use that word, right? That word isn't clear. And so go back and say what it means, say what you mean. So she was really focused on evidence and conclusion. So I think when you think about her policy making, pragmatism, deliberateness are things that I think are very clear. She also has a keen insight to know who's not participating. So that's true whether you're in a meeting and your staff is talking and she can look around the room and tell who hasn't spoken up and she wants to hear from that person, to thinking about, well, how is this policy going to impact somebody who we're not thinking about in this room? Who else should be in this? And when Dobbs happened, which was really a hinge point in the vice presidency for her, I think a lot of the stories that you read about her that people raise questions about are from the first year and a half of her being vice president. Which is, frankly, she was probably learning the job in many ways. Like, she's figuring it out, trying to figure out how things work. And about 4 months after I got there, maybe 6 months almost, the Dobbs decision leaked. And then, and we had a meeting about it. That's the meeting where she sat there and she said, she was sort of going through it. And she said, how dare they? How dare these people do this? How dare they come? And I sat there, and the speechwriter and I talked about it afterwards. And we're like, so put that in the speech, like that's going to go, because that night she was going to speak in front of Emily's list, and so we had to change the entire speech she was going to give that night because of the Dobbs leak. But she is someone who is thinking about who's not there. And that very first day, she started asking questions about IVF. She started asking questions about how do we engage men on this topic? How do we think about LGBTQ Americans? How do we think about, what's the experience of younger girls who are teenagers versus people maybe who are a little older who already have children? Like, how do these things play out in real life terms? And she was always very focused on what's the real life implication of this policy.
You know, you talk about Dobbs as a hinge point in her vice presidency, but it seems like the vice presidency has been a massive hinge point in her political career. I mean, she was a line-level prosecutor, and then she was the attorney general. And in those jobs, you're not thinking about a broad array of political issues. You're thinking about, you know, how to put bad guys in jail or how to protect people in your state. She comes to the Senate. She doesn't have much time. She spent a lot of her effort on the Judiciary Committee, which was her wheelhouse. And then all of a sudden she's running for president. So it seems to me that in these last 3.5 years that she's traveled around the country, none of her principles seem to have changed. She still believes very strongly we have to take action on climate change. We have to make sure healthcare is affordable. We got to make sure the border is secure and orderly. All of that hasn't changed. The only thing that she's changed when she's kind of grown into the job and learned more is the means. And did you feel like when you were working with her, it was flexibility on means but not on ends that was a kind of hallmark of working with her?
Yeah, for sure. Again, as you're thinking about this, being driven by evidence and facts and what's working, what's not working, meeting with people to talk them through it. One of the things that happened with Dobbs, and I really do think, so the vice presidency is a hinge point, and the Dobbs is the hinge point of the vice presidency. One of the things that happened after the Dobbs decision came down was the vice president began this listening tour of talking to so many people around the country about abortion and how they interpreted it. So she talked to legal scholars, she talked to state legislators around the country, and led these, almost like these clinics, where she would sit around with a group of state legislators, and she'd ask them questions, and they'd talk about, you know, what they knew, and she'd tell them what the federal government was working on. And then she'd say, oh, legislator X, you know, in New Jersey, there's somebody in Pennsylvania who's working on something that's similar to that. Staff, can you make sure that they get connected? Because they need to work on these things together. And so she was running these clinics. She talked to faith leaders. She talked to college presidents. She talked to college SGA leaders. So really, you know, delved into it. And one of the things it did was it gave a focus to the vice presidency office, the Office of Communications and Policy. We knew what our first issue was every day. It wasn't the only issue with the vice presidency, but we knew this was a thing that we were focused on throughout the week. And so when you're vice president, you just don't have a lot of oxygen, right? Like, people are following the president, so nobody's really paying attention to what the vice president's doing most of the days.
Unless you screw up, and then there's a ton of oxygen.
Screw up.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, you know, if you're doing 10 things in your vice presidency, people won't remember any of them. But if you do 1 or 2, people kind of can pay attention to what those 1 or 2 are. Dobbs kind of gave that 1 or 2. And the last thing I'll say on this point about the hinge point in her career is when you're the DA or the prosecutor and you stand up and you speak in public, you have someone's life in your hands. Someone's family is thinking about something they lost, whether it was property or a loved one or an experience or something that was devastating to them. And so I think she's very conscious of speaking very clearly about what things mean and using words that matter. And so there's a difference, though, when you're running for president, where how you think and feel about something, what matters to you as a human being, matters as much as the facts of the moment. And so part of, I think, what has happened to her over the last couple of years is she's got more comfortable talking about what's driving her in the decision making and not just the facts of what got to the conclusion.
We are just about out of time. We don't want to run over because Senator Bennett with 1T is coming. But I want to thank Jamal, and I also want to just give a shout out to Liam and Lauren and the Welcome team. This is an extraordinary group of people that we have arrayed before us here, and many of them are young, and I have to say, bringing young people to our part of the party and the progressive movement is incredibly important and exciting. And as our friend Helen Milby says, I think the future is bright. So Jamal, thanks so much.
Thank you.